Daniel, since January 2019, the U.S. media apparatus told us that Juan Guaidó was the new president of Venezuela, but now he's being kicked out essentially by the political establishment. I mean, how did we get to this point? I mean, he was the darling of the Western-backed opposition.
Happy New Year, Rory. Juan Guaidó deserves a prime as the sellout of the year, not just for 2022, but for the past 3 years. He was artificially held up as this interim president, though he had no recognition within Venezuela. He never had any base of support. He was always a creation and a lackey of the U.S. government in their dirty war and their hybrid war against Venezuela. Certainly the Guaidós of the world, the Vendepatrias, the sellouts should have a lot of shame, especially considering how much he encouraged sanctions against the 30 million people of Venezuela, which have been incredibly cruel to the everyday working people of Venezuela.
Well, I mean, there were food stoppages, there were blockades to stop medicine from coming in one of the economies in the world that was struggling so badly, Daniel, and yet there were blockades to stop the people, excuse me, from getting their help. I wanted to ask you, I mean, there are unconfirmed reports that Juan Guaidó, when he was a teenager, was actually an intern at the U.S. State Department in Washington, D.C. Some might say he was theoretically primed and ready to take on a job like this.
The State Department has a long history of priming and preparing and miseducating these local puppets who they can try to operate through. This is indirect colonialism or neo-colonialism or indirect rule. And that's certainly what Juan Guaidó's function was. He needed the rubber stamp of the U.S. government because Venezuela is such a rich piece of the global chessboard, but they needed a Venezuelan puppet that they could point to so that they could seize Venezuelan oil, the Bank of England, so that they could seize Citgo and PDVSA here in the United States. We're talking about billions of dollars in oil, in these other minerals, and they needed Juan Guaidó. They needed a local Venezuelan politician who they could work through to justify this hybrid war and, frankly, what has been highway robbery against the 30 million people of Venezuela.
And yet, Daniel, you know, when this all kicked off, Juan Guaidó was quickly presented with some very nice Washington suits, Washington ties. He had the American little flag on his lapel. You know, first you had Chavez. Washington didn't like Chavez. Then you have Maduro. He was quickly persona non grata with Washington. So Washington says, we're going to put our own man in. They're bringing this guy, Juan Guaidó. At the time, by the way, you mentioned it as well, Daniel, that the Bank of England just seized Venezuela's gold that was sitting there in the London vaults. You know, is this a case of failed Western regime change, or perhaps I'm wrong?
You're 100% correct, Rory. They've had nothing but disdain since Hugo Chavez won the popular election in 1998. They've tried every type of terrorism and economic sabotage to oust Nicolas Maduro, to oust the Bolivarian government. They don't want to see a Telesur. They don't want a CNN of the South that speaks for the people of the South. They don't want to see a Mercosur or UNASUR or a CELAC. They don't want to see economic agreements that link the South with the South. So Venezuela has long been a thorn in their side. Certainly we saw what Venezuela was able to do through its internationalist oil diplomacy in the Chavez years, but when Barack Obama in 2014 implemented these very cruel sanctions and put Venezuela as well as Cuba onto this superficial, made-up list of terrorists. This was the very intention of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger in 1973 when they vowed to make the Chilean economy scream when Salvador Allende was in power. So any socialist or left-leaning government has incurred this type of wrath from Washington.
As it seems, Daniel, history continues to repeat itself. Daniel Shaw, professor of Latin American Studies at the City University of New York, joining us.